What are the parts of the cell theory? Tell me one part of the cell theory. Okay, while you're thinking of the parts of the cell theory, let me just get started. So in 1590, Zachariah Jensen invents the compound microscope. And what was really interesting around that is that as soon as the microscope was invented, it was improved upon 40, 50 years later, 70 years later, but then the idea of microscopy kind of exploded. You had Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who's considered the father of microscopy. He invents this improved compound microscope, and at the same time, other people are inventing microscopes, and right around the same time, Robert Hooke discovers the first cells, right? He takes a look at a piece of cork, and he notices that this piece of cork is divided into these little tiny rectangular rooms, and they remind him of the kinds of places that monks lived at the time. And so he coined this term after these rooms and called them cells. And he didn't really understand what he was looking at, but years later it got shown that all of these cells are in all living things, right? So what are the three parts of the cell theory? What's one of the parts? Go ahead.
All cells come from other cells?
Yeah, cells come from other cells. And that was really one of the later things that was decided, okay? In 1855, Rudolf Virchow proposed all cells come from other cells. And he was able to do that in 1855. It took almost 200 years for that to come about, right? 1663, 1885, over 200 years to decide that. So 200 years worth of cell work went into that, from the discovery until that happened. That's pretty significant to realize like how thorough science is before things get stated as theories, right? Notice we're not calling it the cell law because you can't really see everything that's out there. We haven't discovered everything on the planet. We certainly haven't discovered everything in the universe. And so it can't be proven without a doubt that cells always come from cells. But certainly on this planet, for all the experience that scientists have had for 200 plus years, right? 200 years brings you from 1665 to 1883, but certainly the year 2000, something beyond that's almost another 200 years, we still have only seen cells come from other cells. Now, this is different when we talked about spontaneous generation, right? This idea that living things come from non-living things. And even at the time of Rudolf Virchow, there was controversy, and people said, wait a second, things can arise spontaneously. And so even though Francesco Redi and Louis Pasteur had proven that flies only come from flies and that pasteurization process and that bacteria only come from other bacteria, it took quite a while to realize that cells only come from cells. Okay? So we may have had spontaneous generation at the beginning of time when life first formed. It's one of the theories. But since that time, the conditions of early Earth are not that way. And so cells only come from cells. What's another part of the cell theory? Come on, I talked a lot. I gave you guys time to look things up. You should have come up with the answers by now. What's the other part? Peyton?
All organisms are composed of cells.
Good. Everything's made of cells. And how did they decide that? Well, again, 200 years worth of cell work, right? But really, you had Theodore Schwann in 1839 who had looked at like tons of animals, specimens, kept taking little thin slices of pieces of the animals, their skin, their nails, whatever it was, and kept looking at it and kept seeing cells, right? And then at the same time, you have Matthias Schleiden, 1838, realizes that all plants are made of cells. And how did he come to that conclusion? Well, he looked at thousands upon thousands of specimens of plants and came to that realization, okay? So what's another part of the cell theory, the last part of the cell theory? So we know that cells only come from cells. We know that everything has cells. What's the third part? 2 days worth of reading. We should have this by now. Peyton.
Cells are alive and the basic units of organization in all organisms.
Very good. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in all living things. From the cell theory, we're going to quickly learn that there are things inside cells. They're called organelles. Organ, you know what organs are, I hope. We're going to talk about organs in a minute when we talk about the levels of organization of living things. But organelles, the word organ is in organelles. Organelles means tiny organs. So when people finally started seeing things inside cells, which took quite a while, right? We had to advance the microscope. And so people like Carl Zeiss invented the modern microscope in 1868. And we even have other microscopes, such as the scanning electron microscope, invented in 1955, which really allowed us to see much larger things, much smaller things, and magnify them, make them appear larger. So we're able to see inside cells. And so next week, we're going to learn about the organelles. But the thing about organelles is you can't take an organelle out of a cell and have it be alive. And certainly the cells can't live without the organelles that help them function. So once you try to take apart a cell, it's no longer living. So you have two choices. You are a unicellular organism, right? And you are one cell alive and do everything you need to do with that cell. Or you are a multicellular organism. And if you're multicellular, that means you have to have organization. Okay? You have to have levels of organization. So what do you think is a level of organization of a cell? And if you don't know this, you can look it up. Look up the organization of living things, right? What is bigger than a cell? Or how do cells coordinate when they have many cells? And while you're coming up with these levels of organization, I just want to backtrack smaller than the cell, right? You do have things smaller than cells. You have molecules, which are two or more atoms chemically combined, okay, like H2O, like water, right, which is made of hydrogen and oxygen. So H2O gives you two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom, and chemically combined, they form one molecule of water. And you could break the molecule apart. I can break water apart into hydrogen and oxygen, but it doesn't have the properties of water anymore. Once I break it down, it has the properties of other things. So it has the properties of hydrogen or oxygen, right? Hydrogen gas, oxygen gas, very different than liquid water, okay? So those things are smaller than the cell, molecules and atoms, but they are not considered alive, because once you go smaller than the cell, you do not have a living thing. So let's now work upward from the cell. What's the next level of organization of a living thing after cells? What do we call that level? Anyone find it? Okay, so we call it tissues. Okay, so a tissue is nothing more than a group of the same type of cells performing a similar function. For instance, muscle tissue. Okay, if you're a plant, leaf tissue. You have more than one leaf cell in a leaf. You have more than one muscle cell in your muscle. Okay, but these cells are coordinated to helping the muscle function. Here's another example. Skin tissue. Look at your skin. Okay, you can pull it and it kind of holds together. It kind of all looks similar, right? You have trillions of cells that make up your skin tissue, but it all works together to keep out intruders such as viral and bacterial infections and keep all your body stuff inside, right? Okay, what's the next level of organization beyond tissue? Okay, you should be anticipating this for me so that you all have Chromebooks and computers and looking these things up as I'm talking to you, right? So the next level is the organ, right? Give me examples of types of organ. Just call them out. Brain, lungs. What else you got? Liver, heart. What'd you say? Bladder, mouth, stomach, intestines. And what an organ is something that uses different types of tissue to perform a function. Let's talk about the heart. What does your heart do? Pump. Your heart does not breathe. Your heart does not breathe, but your heart does pump blood. But hold on to breathing, so I want you to think about that with the next level. Okay? Your heart pumps blood. Is your heart just blood to pump blood? What do you think your heart is if it moves? What are things that move things in your body called? Muscles. The heart's a muscle, absolutely. So there's muscle tissue, there's blood tissue, there's also nerve tissue, because the heart doesn't just decide to beat on its own. Even though you don't control it consciously, your brain is controlling it unconsciously. Okay, so the signals have to be sent from the brain to the heart. There's some fat tissue for storage of energy, so the heart and muscles can contract and do their work. So that's just an example of an organ. So groups of tissues that are working together. If we're back to talking about skin, you don't just have this layer of skin cells. You have blood supply to the skin. If I were to prick myself with a pin anywhere, I would see blood immediately coming from the skin, right? Under that, you can see hair coming out of your skin. So there's hair follicles. There is muscle under the skin that helps to kind of control and compress the veins and things and arteries and blood vessels that are around it. Okay, so lots of different types of tissues in your organs. And what is beyond the organ? What's the next level? Let's talk about breathing for a minute. How do you breathe? What organs are involved in breathing? Lungs. Anything else involved? The mouth. What else? Nostrils. What else? You breathe so you can get that oxygen and send it around your body. So what else is involved? No, that's part of your digestive. But anyway, you have all these different organs. What do you think you call your breathing? What system is that? Respiratory system. So when you have groups of organs working together, you have a system, right? So that's the next level. So like the respiratory system's not just your lungs, it's not just your but also even your heart. You might say, well, that's circulatory. Well, that systems overlap, right? What is their purpose? So, in breathing, you want to get oxygen in, and you want to get oxygen because you want to get it to your cells. Well, how does it get there? It's got to get into your circulatory system. It's got to get into your blood supply. Okay, let's talk about the digestive system. All right, you have a mouth that chops the food up, goes down your esophagus into your stomach, which churns and mixes and chemically digests that food, makes it into a mush. Then it goes to your intestines, and the good nutrients are absorbed into your blood supply. So lots of organs working together help to do that. Okay. Other systems, other examples. How are you reacting and responding? What system would that be? How are you thinking? How are you raising your hand if you want to raise your hand? How are you deciding I want to go to the bathroom and go and walking that way? How are you doing those things? What system would that be?
Nervous system.
Nervous system, very good. So not just your brain. I can think about walking, but if I don't affect my muscles, I can't walk, right? So there's another system, skeletal muscular system. Skeleton and muscles working together to make bones move. So what do you have above organ systems? What's the highest level of organization? It's a multicellular organism. So you have two choices. You have everything you need in a tiny little package called one single cell because you are a unicellular organism, or you are a large multicellular organism and you have these other levels of organization of your cells to tissues, to organs, organ systems, and finally a complex organism. And it's different for each type of organism. For instance, plants have organs and organ systems. They're just different than ours. Even the earthworm actually has a lot of similar organs and organ systems to a human, although they may be arranged differently. Insects, earthworms, all of these things are complex multicellular organisms. They have levels of organization. So I hope this was helpful, the cell theory and how cells are organized in our lives.